My name's Richard Wareing. I'm a product engineer at Facebook, and I've been, working on some relatively large projects through my career at Facebook. And this is kind of the talk I wish someone would have given me like 5 years ago to save me a lot of pain. So a bit of what I've learned on building consensus, why we do it at Facebook, like actually the different pieces of our engineering culture that require it, and then I'll get into kind of my lessons or tips, and then I'll try and demonstrate some of those tips in an actual kind of case study, actually a pretty recent case study, going through a consensus process at Facebook. All right, so let me preface this by saying there are many types of decision-making styles out there, and I'm not here to, I'm not making a value judgment on like whether one is better than the others. I think depending on the situation, the company, the culture, different decision-making styles make total sense. Military authority, hey, when you're in a trench, bullets flying overhead, you don't have time to poll your troops to determine do you go over the hill or do you go over the trench? Seconds can mean life or death. Similarly, you're governing millions and millions of people. Clearly, probably not going to be possible to do consensus. We have to make some trade-offs. Unfortunately, this majority rule is kind of the idea we've come up with. It's as they say, the worst method of governing, except for every other one we've tried. And then there's consensus. I think there's some pretty interesting situations where we've chosen to use this. I think human spaceflight is probably a pretty interesting example. If you've ever watched NASA TV, before they choose to launch the rocket, they'll have the flight director. He's polling all of his controllers to make sure that, hey, are we go for launch? And if even one of them says, hey, there's something wrong, that one person can stop the whole show. When there's human lives at stake, strapping on, riding on a rocket with 1.5 million pounds of rocket fuel, probably a good idea. Another area, court system, when we're doing trials, if someone's freedom's at stake, we have juries, and it's unanimous consensus required there as well. All right, so let's, before we get into consensus itself, I think it's important to kind of learn a bit about Facebook engineering culture and some of the ways we actually encourage consensus building, and in some ways strongly encourage consensus building. So for any of you that have ever been to our offices, we love posters. We really love posters. We have them all around. And I'll kind of walk you through some of these posters and to our engineering culture. All right, so first in favors the bold, be bold. This is really a key piece of our engineering culture is we want engineers to speak up if they see something wrong, if they see something that could be done better. We want them to voice those opinions. And we also want to foster a culture of diversity in opinions. Which brings me to another key piece of our culture, diversity itself. So we're a company that runs multiple services that provide service to billions of people, and we want our culture and our working force and our decision-making process to really reflect this diverse this diverse world that we're serving. There's a lot of features, for example, that we've written that may make a lot of sense in a given geographic area, but they make no sense in some other geographic area. Without this kind of thought diversity, we would not discover these things, we would not fix these things, and that would be a big problem. Bottoms up. Basically, this means that we are empowering our engineers who own the service to make the decisions about that service. I'll get into that a little bit more detail as we get further in. This means direction of a service. For example, the roadmap is heavily determined by the ICs, and individual contributors, sorry, Facebook lingo. All right, so done versus perfect. You're going to see these signs all around our offices as well. Really what we're talking about here is we will strive to get to a V1, and then we want to iterate on that. What we're not usually going to do in our culture is we're not going to go into a cave somewhere, work on something for 3 or 4 years, and then kind of come out with, the perfect solution based on kind of a laundry list of requirements that may have changed in the intervening years. The industry just moves way too quickly in order for us to kind of have that kind of approach. Empathy. This is actually kind of sometimes a shocker to a lot of engineers that join from other companies that may not have this kind of culture ingrained within them. This really means that when someone goes home from work at the end of the day working at Facebook, they should not feel like they've been disrespected. They should not feel like they have not been heard. They should not feel crappy when they go home. This is really that is a litmus test if we're doing a good job in leading with empathy and treating each other with empathy. So in other words, how you accomplish something matters as much as what you accomplished. There's many cases where people might have, launched the most amazing product or moved some metric in some way, but how they did it may have left a large impact crater behind them, and in those cases, that impact is actually it's kind of muted in that case, because just how they went about that was not appropriate with our culture. All right, so service ownership model. I kind of talked about this. This is my girlfriend's cat. I like to think of there's kind of 2 service ownership models. The cat model, which is you can own a cat, but anyone who's owned a cat knows you do not have authority over the cat. You can tell them they're just going to do whatever they want to do anyways. I like to think we have the dog ownership model. You own the dog. Generally, as long as you treat the dog with respect, nurture it, more or less you have some authority over that dog. This is kind of our model. If you work on the service, you get to make the choices related to that service. In other words, there's not going to be some director or vice president that's going to come down on high and say, hey, we need this feature, I'm ordering you to go do it. They may say something kind of broad and say, hey, this is a strategy the company wants to execute, or this is maybe a large-scale approach that you want to take to solving some problem, but you, the engineer, will be responsible for figuring out how it's done. So they're not going to be prescriptive on telling you, hey, this is going to be the layer of the feature. Here's a bunch of diagrams. Just go execute this plan. All right, so let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts of consensus building. I think Wikipedia is always a great place to start. So consensus building is decision-making. Consensus decision-making is a group decision-making process in which the group members develop and agree to support a decision in the best interest of the whole group or common goal. All right, so what does it mean? So we generally start out with an idea. I'd say in most consensus process, we're going to get into a group. With Facebook, often this results us having to go back to the drawing board. This could mean, in many cases, we're going to do a proof of concept. As you'll see in the case study, sometimes this means we go off and collect data in order to kind of vet the idea a little bit better. We're not scared of throwing ideas away. There's a lot of reasons why you might want to throw an idea away. Sometimes the idea is just too soon, not the right time. Sometimes, for whatever reason, we just cannot get kind of group consensus, and this is a price we're willing to pay in order to foster and not ruin the trust that we have between colleagues and between teams. So I think this is I'll get into kind of some of the challenges, but this is kind of a price we're willing to pay with consensus building. Hopefully, more often than not, though, we actually arrive at some consensus. And we go build whatever it is we're going to build, and we profit. All right, so I kind of touched on some challenges there. Let's get a little bit more specific. So I think it's easier said than done finding that that consensus or that consensus point in a project or an idea. This can be really tough. And it's definitely one of the challenges of consensus building, frustrates a lot of people. Some of the tips I'll kind of talk about in a moment will hopefully help you to achieve this a little bit easier. Speed is a common critique to consensus building. I think some other concepts, like, for example, disagree and commit are out there that kind of tweak consensus building a little bit, try and expedite the process a little bit. They have their own challenges, but they've been successful in some environments. This is one I think some people have a hard time with. I'll talk about this again in a little bit. This is like, people struggle with the concept that they may have like the absolute optimal solution in their mind, but they can't really convince everyone else it's the optimal solution. But they may be right, but in order to achieve the consensus, they may actually have to like settle for something slightly less than optimal. This is something a lot of us engineers have a really big challenge with. I know I did personally. It took me kind of actually like probably a couple, like 2 or 3 years, like working on this kind of intentionally to actually get a little bit more comfortable with it. And we'll talk about this in a bit. And finally, sometimes you just can't achieve consensus at all. And as I kind of spoke about in the last slide, the price we pay is, some really great ideas actually we either can't do yet or we can't do them at all. All right, let's talk about some anti-patterns. So part of my job, I actually try to like be the change I want to see. I actually started like mentoring, and actually we developed a bit of a tech lead training program inside our org. And these are kind of some of the anti-patterns that we've seen in the past, and I think since we've been starting to kind of be more intentional about our training around consensus building, we're seeing less of it. So what were these kind of patterns? Avoidance. So this is the, maybe you have some great idea, people maybe, aren't buying in, or you're struggling winning them over. A lot of time people just be like, screw it, I'm going to go do it anyways. It's kind of maybe the field of dreams approach. If you build it, maybe they will come. Unfortunately, much of the time they don't come. And then you feel like you've wasted your time. You can be really frustrating. On the other side of the coin, I think it's important to know that like there's always two sides of consensus building. It's sometimes maybe the person that created the idea, but it's also those of us that maybe are the advising on the idea, or maybe we're a stakeholder on the idea. This is like a common not so great anti-pattern that some of us may have used in the past, which is kind of what I call the landmine critique or technique. The idea is like someone's proposing a new idea. It's the dumbest idea you've ever heard of in your life. The odds of this succeeding are like precisely 0. Why even bother engaging with them? This thing is going to crash and burn like the day they launch it, right? Like we can just cut to the chase. I'm going to go work on something else. The problem with this, of course, is like some poor soul or souls is going to waste months and months of their time. The company may be wasting millions or tens of millions of dollars on the project. So it really, it's really important for engineers to really participate in these projects, like these consensus building process. And even though it may be tough and hard to convince them that maybe this idea needs to be changed in a certain way, or maybe shouldn't happen at all, I think it's important to like not landmine your colleagues in this process. Authority. This one, we actually make this pretty tough at Facebook. We have a no-level environment, so if you're an engineer at Facebook, you actually won't know what level they are. They don't tell. It is completely hidden. So we actually kind of take this ability away from our engineers on purpose. This is like kind of a very explicit way that we really try and encourage consensus building and avoid people using authority. The problem with authority is you get into this world of like cognitive dissonance. So this is like, hey, someone's asking you to do X. You actually don't believe in it, but they're coming over the top of you with authority and saying like, just do it anyways. Now you've got, those nights when maybe someone has done this to you, you're tossing and turning at night, maybe you can't sleep. That's cognitive dissonance. That is your brain trying to like square the circle, trying to like figure out how to kind of reconcile this thing you have to do with this thing you actually don't believe in. And the result of that, no passion, you're not going to put the extra effort in, quality could suffer, you're just not going to wake up in the morning and want to actually, build this thing that you're being asked to build. Bike shedding, I think most people are familiar with this one. You just, maybe you're in that room, you're discussing the idea, and you end up talking about some part of the solution that is actually not super critical to the outcome of the project. I think in these cases, we just need to know, like, when we're getting into that bike shedding scenario and just kind of back off. Where the bike shedding, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of the idea of, like, we're building a shed and we start arguing over the color of the shed, but not actually the design of the shed. The color is kind of irrelevant to the shed, at least from an engineering point of view. Maybe designers might differ. All right, escalation. I think this one is pretty common anti-pattern as well. Maybe I'm friends with a director, maybe I'm friends with a vice president, or maybe my manager is more powerful than your manager, and I'm just going to go over to their office and say, hey, we need to do X. Maybe they trust you more than they trust maybe the newer engineers, and you just escalate and have them like announce this at the next all hands or something like this. My view on this is I think this works probably maybe once, maybe twice if you're lucky. At Facebook, we make this pretty tough in that we actually make it pretty easy for people to change teams. So if you start kind of, pulling escalation on people, you could find yourself a tech lead with no one to lead, because people may be just rotating off your team. So I think this is, it's not a shortcut that we like people taking. That said, there are times to do this, and I'll get into this towards the end if we've got some time. All right, so build and maintain trust. So I think trust is super important between engineers. Frankly, those that are actually kind of avoid consensus building because due to the speed, I would encourage them to really think about how much trust they have on the team and how much trust they have between teams. Because frankly, I think having this trust is actually one of those things that actually allows you to move quicker. Classic case of this is people actually do consensus building on their team really, really well usually. You see these people every single day. You see their code every day. So when that engineer comes to you and maybe you've got to build this feature, you've got to fix this bug, and in many cases, it may only take 1 or 2 meetings to actually achieve consensus on how you want to write this feature. And a lot of that is because you're willing to take a lot more leaps of faith with people you trust. There are just details you don't need to know. Maybe you've seen this engineer knock various features out of the park time and time again, and maybe the way that they're describing their implementation isn't quite how you would do it, but because they've got this track record, because you have this trust with them, you're gonna make that leap of faith with them. Let me back up. Okay, so building a track record, I think this one's also important. This is where a lot of the time we see the too soon case. In this case, there we go. In this case, sometimes there's just not enough trust between teams to actually do the thing you want to do. I think this is a perfectly reasonable thing to kind of recognize, and in some cases you just have to take a step back. You may have to actually if you've got some really kind of the larger idea, kind of the more kind of groundwork or foundational work you may have to do ahead of that. So you can, if there's this idea you've got and you really want to go chase it, I think you need to look for opportunities to build trust with those kind of partner teams. That builds the trust, and then that helps them kind of take those leaps of faith with you that I just kind of talked about. Language, I think this is kind of a detail that a lot of us are pretty busy, we're in a rush, and we can get sloppy with our language. This can actually kind of erode trust bit by bit. We get into these us versus, or us and them kind of mentalities when, we're all in the same company, maybe we're in the same org, we're really all trying to achieve some, greater goal. So I think it's just important to kind of watch your trust or watch your wording when you're making posts. And finally, when you've got this trust, you need to nurture and protect it. This allows you to move quicker in the future. So if you've done some big successful project with 2 or 3 teams in your org or in your company, you'll probably find the next time you have to go do a big project with them, since you've built that trust and you've actually got some experience with them, it's going to just allow you to move quicker. So I think it's important to nurture this trust once you've got it and protect it. All right, shared view. So this is one where I think a lot of us often, considering how many different graphics you can find on Google of this, I think it's a pretty universally problem that people have. And this is the idea that we may be looking at some problem or some solution to a problem, and we may not even really all agree on what the big picture is. In a case study, I'll get into kind of a really concrete example of the different kind of stakeholders in this project actually looking at the problem completely differently, and we actually have to step back and actually solve that first. All right, be intentional about alignment. So what do we mean by alignment? It means we want to agree on different aspects of the problem that we're trying to solve. It means we want to agree on what the solution requirements are. So, is it scale? Is it reliability? We want to agree on the unknowns and the non-goals. Don't assume that what you think are the non-goals or what your stakeholders agree are the non-goals. Same goes with unknowns. As well as data. Often people will actually be showing, I've seen a ton of charts, I've seen a ton of tables, and sometimes we can be looking at this and the impression that I have in my head on that chart is completely different than what they have. So I think it's important, also the confidence level of the data, maybe the way they're speaking, it kind of, makes you believe that this is scale amongst a large portion of your maybe your customer base when actually it may be just a sample. So I think it's important to really understand what the confidence level of the data is and making sure that you are interpreting it the same as your teammates or your stakeholders. And finally, expectations. I think you want to align on what those expectations are. So what is the expectations of the project? What is the expectation of your partner teams? Be intentional about this. Take the time to do it. Okay, so this one I think is a little bit harder, and I think this one's been probably a bit of a journey for me to actually learn how to be good at this. And that is when you're the one that is trying to build consensus on something, you actually have to take more of the mindset of being a facilitator versus trying to push maybe the solution that you actually think is the best solution. I think at least initially, step back. If you do a good job at this, people may not even realize what your view is on the solution. So in this case, you can kind of reveal what you think the problem is. And you can say, hey, we need to go solve this problem, but actually try and resist the temptation to actually really being vocal about what you think the solution is. It can just end up kind of shutting down discussion. There may be people that really, really look up to you, and it can kind of shortcut, you can kind of shortcut the process in their mind by just kind of, defaulting by agreeing with you. So what that can mean is have strong opinions when you get into this. So when you are revealing what you when you are revealing what your belief is, or on any of the things being discussed, but being willing to move off of those opinions. The other piece at Facebook, I think this is probably a really key piece at Facebook, which is focusing on the data versus theory, opinions, or experience. At Facebook, the problem is you will find experts on nearly everything. You will find people that are equally qualified on almost the exact same topic, and they may have completely opposing views on something. So it's not as simple as, well, we're going to seek out the expert on X. In many of the discussions we have, we may have 4 experts on X. And they all may have different ways of approaching it. Even if any of you participate in the kernel community, you pretty much see this all the time. There's just a lot of really smart people in almost every area, and there's going to be just different approaches. Same thing goes with experience. Everyone may have different experiences, so they may have seen some things be successful in their environment, where other people may have seen something fail. So in our world, we really want to bring data to that, which is specific to Facebook. In this case, it could mean it's a proof of concept, or as you'll see in the case study, we may go back and look at historical data to actually figure out what the right approach is. So being a dissenter also, or being a facilitator also means making sure that in the consensus building process that you're not you're kind of creating a good environment to actually get this thought diversity. This means you actually want to move towards your dissenters and your critics, not away from them. however tempting it might be, it's really important. The reason for this is eventually the dissenters and the critics will come out of the woodwork, and you don't want to do it when you've basically written code for 6 months and just spent another 6 months maybe releasing. You want to really talk to them early on in the process. All right, consider the venue. This is like kind of a common, this is probably one of the biggest mistakes I made when I started out, which is my manager would be like, hey, go solve this problem. Just get everyone into a room. Just get everyone into a room, have a big chat. You'll come out with like, you'll come up with a design and, we'll be away to the races next week. Instead, it actually ended up kind of often ending up like this. If you can't actually, if you don't really, if you go into that room kind of having no idea what people actually are thinking about or what their opinions are on your proposed solution, or what even the problem is, it can just end up being kind of a pretty big disaster. So I think, you need to think about doing it differently. So what should you do differently? Initially, I actually kind of think about this as like kind of being something of a diplomat. So if you've ever seen when they negotiate trade agreements, they show those lovely signing ceremonies. Well, the reason those signing ceremonies are so lovely is because they've actually done months and months and months of groundwork and legwork behind the scenes. And what they're really doing is they're kind of meeting with different stakeholders separately. So in a trade agreement, they might be meeting with like dairy farmers and textile manufacturers. And you kind of got to think of your role a little bit like that. So in this case, identify, maybe it's not dairy farmer and textile, but it could be like the different stakeholders on the given project, and kind of like really just meet with them. Again, don't put out what, maybe what you would advocate being the solution, but just like listen to them and say, hey, do you think this is a problem? Do you agree this is the problem? What do they think the solution might be? And this is really demonstrating also empathy to them. So you're really being intentional about really getting in their shoes, understanding how they see the world. 101. So I talked about like moving to dissenters. You don't want to be doing that in a group discussion. This can get people just simply behave differently in a group than they will one-on-one. And if there's something really contentious, like the last thing you want to do is get contentious in a group setting. It's probably unprofessional, and people can in some cases feel in some cases humiliated or just really disrespected in that kind of an environment. So I think it's important, have a one-on-one, understand their point of view, and move to those engineers that might be vocal and disagreeing. And you'd be surprised what you find out. Most engineers are maybe vocally opposed to something because they really, really care. These are people that they do not wake up in the morning and figure out how they can 10 ways they can say no. They really care about probably your company, your org, and what they do. So it's really important to we have this thing at Facebook assume good intent, and that's what we mean. All right, avoiding the local Maxima trap. This was one that was not super obvious to me when I was starting out. I used to see the world like this. I had, maybe there's some large project I'm involved. I'm working on some feature, and I've got in my head what the optimal, solution to that feature might be, and I'm gonna fight tooth and nail to have this feature done in the way I think it should be done, because maybe it's gonna save resources or be more efficient or quicker to do. But what I wasn't really seeing is, hey, there's actually this giant project that we're actually trying to achieve. And what we really want to do is get to this end state, and maybe this feature that I'm working on is actually important and critical, but whether we do it my super optimal way or the way actually the group is really pushing for, it's actually not that big of a difference in the big scheme of things. So I think it's important to kind of think about are you pushing for some global maxima? Or are you really arguing for some local maxima? And if indeed it's a local maxima, be okay with just something slightly less optimal in order to kind of move forward. I think that's really important to really internalize. All right, a case study. So this was a process we went through, I guess, last year, we were revving, we're actually in the process of improving the way we do load shedding, one of our storage systems. And initially, when this all started, there were various leaders in our org kind of came to me and were like, hey, like, how can we make throttling a better experience? So that's kind of maybe the customer view. You go talk to maybe the service owner, and they're like, you know, that's great, but like different customers are asking for different features. So like, you know, what do we do? You know, I talked to, you know, team X, and they're asking for one feature. I talked to team Y, they asked for a totally different feature. So we've kind of, you know, this is a case where like we lack consensus on what to do. As it turned out, we also lacked kind of agreement on like what the problem was. Was it some people were like, oh, we're solving resource contention within a customer. You know, so say you've got, you know, I work in the data warehouse, so imagine you've got a Spark or Presto query, and maybe these different queries are like colliding in terms of their resource demands. So maybe that's, you know, some people had that was the view that of the problem we were solving. You know, maybe from the you know, the storage team's point of view, they were like, no, we're solving resource contention between customers or tenants in the storage system. Others are like, no, we're solving, you know, clarity on how the load is shed or throttled. So these are kind of things we need to like agree on the outset. Once we did that, so in order to do that, this is where, so once I kind of figured out that, you know, not everyone was seeing the world eye to eye, it was pretty much kind of roadshow time. My teammate Dan actually calls this like gathering the roots. Apparently there's some ancient Japanese axiom around this. But it's actually pretty good wisdom. So initially kind of just met with, you know, the XFN teams, or like these are basically the stakeholders of this project, figure out what everyone's views are and why. I had a ton of one-on-ones. Actually, there was kind of a process where we kind of went back and forth on this, had one-on-ones, go meet with stakeholders, have more one-on-ones. And the idea here is just kind of inching people towards consensus before we kind of get people in a big room to actually kind of iron out the final details. So you kind of think of this, so by the time we got in this big room where we were actually kind of all deciding if this was the direction we wanted to go, most of the major issues were kind of already fairly well aligned. At that point, it was really, you know, some more minor disagreements that frankly we just needed to get everyone in the room to actually to get a decision on. The other good news is because a lot of these larger decisions are already kind of pre-aligned, people are just more willing to move on some of the smaller aspects of or smaller decisions that you need to make once kind of the bigger questions are all resolved. All right, so even then, we got to a point where we're like, okay, we've got, you know, what we think is a plan, and then one of our leaders kind of comes and is like, yeah, you know, this is great, but you think this will work? Some engineers would be like, you know, do we really need feature X? Are we trading problem X for problem Y? In order to actually kind of answer some of these questions, we went back, looked at some historical data, and I actually kind of simulated this solution, or like the throttling model that we were actually coming up with, using historical data, went through and looked at, you know, various cases where, you know, the throttling would have kicked in, and actually looked at how it would have impacted the different systems in our stack, and then showing that that indeed modeling, or like bucketing the I/O in a certain way and having limits along certain boundaries would actually indeed work based on the data. So I talked about the local Maxima trap. What did it actually look like in this case? So what were some of the things that maybe in my head I had a certain optimal solution, but things that I actually had to compromise on, or my colleagues had to compromise on? So throttling granularity, some people, you know, if you left it up to some of the customers, we wanted to slice and dice throttling 10 ways from Sunday. We wanted, you know, potentially millions of different buckets to put I/O into. But we have to like achieve some sort of a compromise with our colleagues, because obviously the complexity of actually pulling that stuff off varies depending on what we're going to do. The throttling boundaries. So where should the boundary of throttling be? Should it be at a high level? Should it be between tenants? Should it be between maybe buckets that are within tenants, or should it even be below that? These are things we had to discuss and compromise on. And then there is, of course, as in any project, implementation details, different systems that we build our store systems on. They're sharded. They could be sharded in a certain way, which actually, forces certain decisions on you, or if you wanted to make certain changes, you may have to re-architect things that are lower in the stack. So we have to think about those things and make those trade-offs. All right, so once we went through data, basically we gave some people some time to digest the data. This actually ended up being a dashboard that people could interact with. They could actually go through the different scenarios. At that point, had more one-on-ones, worked to close more of those gaps based on the data that they were seeing. In some cases, actually one of the more interesting questions that I sometimes will ask when someone is just really not wanting to buy in on something. I think one of the more interesting questions you can ask is hey, if you can change anything, here's the gavel, you can do anything you want. What would it be that you would change in order to buy in on this? And I think this kind of gets people out of that mode of kind of saying being Dr. No and actually thinking okay, what would it take to get to yes? And I think this is kind of if you really have a situation where, just no matter what you say or no matter how much data you bring to the table, I think that's a key question to ask people. Finally, we had more XFN meetings, or basically meetings between stakeholders, close the smaller gaps, we achieved consensus. And then the final test is really is everyone willing to put their name on this thing? So when we do a consensus process like this is not something that I am putting out. This is not something my org is putting out. This is something altogether we are putting out. And this is the names on all the engineers that were involved in this is on this thing. And it's a really good gut check whether you actually did achieve consensus, because once this thing is written up, people have gone through the draft. If they're not willing to put their name on it, then that's a big red flag. That means somewhere along the lines something went wrong. All right. Got a little bit of time, so I'm going to go through one extra thing. So I kind of talked about disagreeing commits. I kind of touched on this at the beginning. This is kind of a decision-making process that was popularized and I think well used at Amazon. And one question, so when I actually started kind of learning more intentionally about consensus building, we have this kind of yearly summit where a lot of senior engineering leaders get together at our company, and I asked them, okay, consensus building works, I'd say, most of the time, but what do you do when it's just not working at all? And what would we do that is what does the decision-making process look like that may require some sort of escalation that is consistent with our culture? So we actually met as a pretty big group, and this is basically one thing we came up with. And you can kind of think of this as a take on disagree and commit, but there is, I think, a really important tweak to the process. So we have the attempts at consensus. Maybe we do some POCs. Maybe we get consensus, but let's take a look at the case where we don't. In this case, what we decided is actually having the idea of a trusted arbiter. I think the key difference here between disagree and commit is really this. The idea here is someone who is going to make this, basically make the call here, is trusted by both parties. The reason trust here is important is going back to the idea of cognitive dissonance. If you trust the person that ultimately has to make this hard call, you're probably going to be able to sleep well at night, that they knowing that they made the call, versus maybe someone who has an interest in the way the decision was made. For example, if the person making the decision is the person that is advocating for a given project, like, of course they're going to advocate and rule that their project is the best one. Like, the idea here is you want someone a little bit more neutral, who is trusted by both groups. Sometimes people are like, well, what if I can't find anyone? And, my answer there is like, eventually, hopefully, if you up, your reporting chain, you will get to some person in your company, or ideally maybe an engineer who's like fairly senior in your company, really well respected, where if they're given enough data and context on the decision you're trying to make, that everyone will be will be able to live with it. In some cases, the trusted arbiter may choose, again, they may come back to the conclusion not ready, not now, or not ever. In some cases, they may just decide what the solution is and go build it. But in other cases, they may choose to bet on both. And I think if the resources exist in a company to do this, I think this is something that, and I think this differs from disagree and commit on this count as well, which is, in some cases, build both, see what happens. At least get to a POC stage. Competition can be a good thing, and again, this going back to data, you're going to get a monstrosity or monstrous amount of data from a POC that you're just not going to have if you didn't do it. All right, so final thoughts. Consensus building is challenging. It can be time-consuming, but I think it's worth it. It builds trust between teams and within teams. It's essential for a healthy bottoms-up culture. If you've got a bottoms-up culture, it's pretty hard to do top-down decision-making. It just won't work. And it helps foster inclusion and diversity of thought. If there is a small select group of people calling the shots, it's pretty hard to have everyone heard. And I think ultimately it results in higher confidence decisions. Just coming back to the mission control example, they need to have absolute confidence that things are going to work. When they're launching those rockets, for large-scale projects in large orgs or in the open source community, when you're working on potentially a feature that could affect tens or hundreds of companies using your open source, I think you really do want high confidence decisions to be made. All right, questions, and I'll just repeat the questions. And we'll avoid passing the microphone because news.
So how do you handle projects that naturally would flow from top down? So things like resource constraints or security or something that's kind of a top-down mandate on what needs to happen? What does that look like?
Sure. So the question is, how do we handle some decisions that absolutely just need to come from top down? For example, security or kind of policy-driven decisions. So yeah, that's a fair point. Again, there the way is to avoid anyone being prescriptive. So in our culture, it's perfectly fine for Zuck, for example, to get up there and say, hey, this is super important. We need to execute on this. But what he's not going to say is and you need to architect it this way, or he's not going to have one of his lieutenants kind of come up with some architecture and say this is how it's going to be architected. In fact, if you were to go into what we call big bet reviews, where people are actually kind of giving a status update on some of these large projects, you may end up having a leader simply push back on you and say, hey, no, that's your job. That's not my job to go figure out, how to architect this. That's your job. So I think on some of these things, it's really the type of decisions that are coming from top down are not going to be getting into the weeds of how it's going to be done. So execution is really in the hands of the engineers. Kind of policy is definitely maybe coming top down because frankly, at our level, we're just not going to be in a good place to be making policy decisions or strategic decisions. So it just, those things just kind of make sense. That said, I'm sure even, at those echelons, I suspect there's consensus going on there too. I'm pretty sure that those folks aren't just kind of coming out of their house one day and say, hey, we need to do X. They're probably doing some consensus building amongst people that they trust, and at those levels. Yeah. Yes.
So when you have two conflicting opinions end up with an actual and a hypothetical one. One of the issues I usually see is that when you start building it, the actual one faces critique and faces problems, and the hypothetical one remains perfect because, if we did that, that would have gone perfectly well. So that there's a lot of people who avoid voicing their opinions a lot because they fear being responsible for the actual solution. So how do you go about diminishing this problem?
Okay, so is this, so you're asking, when you're making a decision between say, some concrete solution that exists today and maybe a theoretical solution that may exist in the future, or?
Pick one direction to go, right?
Yep.
Do A or B.
Okay.
If we do A, every time A faces a problem, someone's going to say, B wouldn't have that. So it
Yep.
only keeps increasing the pressure.
Kind of like the grass is greener. Yeah. Yeah. So I think in terms of so one, I think this is actually a big challenge. I think when possible, I think this is where the POCs are really important because I think I think this is where also empathy is important because I'm we've all been junior engineers at some point in our careers, and I think more senior engineers probably catch that a little bit sooner because they've been through enough projects where it seems super, or even built a project where it seems super rosy on the outset. You kind of get into actually building this thing, and then the problems that you did not anticipate start cropping up, and it ends up not being maybe as reliable or scalable as the thing you intended to replace. So some of this I think is experience. So I think this is where empathy is super important. Is one to acknowledge to those engineers hey, even in my career, you can go through your own experience and say, hey, here's some examples where I built things where I thought it was gonna be better than the thing it was replacing, and it didn't. Here's why. You can encourage them to build a POC. Or proof of concept, and actually see if they can collect, generate some data. That also may get them far enough down the road where some of these kind of edge cases will start to pop up, and they actually have to start thinking about them. And if they don't pop up, then that's great. Then indeed, the grass is greener on the other side. So I think those are kind of the two approaches that I would take. Yes.
So you talked about the structure of the org at Facebook. How would you say we could apply this methodology in an organization where you don't have that, where there is very much a hierarchy and an authority-based management style? How do we take some of this stuff and implement it in a structure where people are going to pull rank or say, no, because I said so?
Yeah. So some engineers have come to us sometimes and say, hey, the fact that you're training us is great and you have this training program is great and things like that. But they say, hey, my experience is actually maybe there's a tech lead in their org or their team who is just not, we're a big company, so there's going to be pockets where some of this stuff is not happening the way it should. So in those cases, the advice I usually give is, one, seek out allies within your company or your org who want to operate in this way. In our company, it's pretty easy because it's just, there's going to be a lot more people that are going to be consensus builders than otherwise. The other thing is, you can build consensus on the other side. So if there, for example, there's, maybe a top-down decision coming at you that's maybe super prescriptive, then in that case you can actually, build consensus on, the side that's saying, hey, maybe we've got to slow down, or maybe we need to POC this, and try and get consensus from the other side of the table. And in those cases, it may be, it may give that, that the person that's making the authority-based decision some pause and say, okay, well, this isn't just one engineer who is opposing this. This is actually 4 or 5 engineers who are all opposing this. So I think in consensus you can use to get something done, but you can also potentially use it put the brakes on something that may be either top down or just maybe not such a great idea. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Is there a minimum team size where this can be implemented in your experience?
So the question is there a minimum team size where consensus building kind of works? So I'd say that's So at Facebook, at least, I can speak to our teams. So teams, I would say, vary on the small end, maybe 3 engineers. Middle of the road might be something like 5 to 8, and then larger teams might be 10 to 15. In our case, generally, if teams get a fairly big size, we'll actually break them down into pods. Is kind of a common kind of structure that we see. And within at least those pods, there should be relatively good consensus building. And then between pods, you should be able to, have enough trust between, like, say, the tech leads of the different pods, where it will really be their job to, like, build consensus between each other. So I'd say, like, try and scale it up. And the idea here is always going to be, like, maintaining the trust between kind of these like, threads between the different parts of your company. So I'd say it can work at almost any scale, but like the trust is going to be super important because like ultimately in order for it to scale, you have to have people that trust each other. So like when the tech lead came back from that meeting and says, hey, on behalf of our team, I agreed on X, like hopefully everyone trusts that engineer enough to do the buy-in part. In some cases, I think another good behavior is like, you can always do the I agree, but like just say, hey, I do need to go back and consult my team and make sure everyone buys in. And sometimes that simple act of going back to your team and saying, hey, I didn't like sign our life away on this. I really am coming to you for like any of you in the room here can have a veto here if you really feel strongly about that. And often just you being the tech lead and like giving them that kind of power not only shows respect and empathy towards them, but in many cases, just by saying that, they're gonna, unless they really, really disagree, they're probably gonna trust you and kind of take that leap. All right.